يثبت الله الذين آمنوا بالقول الثابت في الحياة الدنيا وفي الآخرة.
So the idea that Islamic law is coming back is a modern fantasy. You know, this kind of idea that some of these Islamic movements have put out there, we need to reestablish Sharia. You're going to apply Sharia in the modern world. You know, you create consumer societies, put false desires into people, and then you're going to, cut off their hands when they steal things. Yeah, I don't think it's going to work. So, I'm not an advocate of re-implementation of hudud and all these things. I think it's long gone. It's been long gone. If Muslims were literally taken from like 8th century Syria or Palestine and dropped into Norway, they would think that, it was like the caliphate of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. Like there's so much social justice. They would be amazed at how much social justice are in these Scandinavian countries. They're secular countries. So this whole idea, but no, you have to have had punishment. This is what, so Islam is reduced to, there's 4 agreed upon had punishments, 13, there's debates about, even apostasy laws, all these things, they're all debated. There's nothing fixed in stone. And then the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Idra'u al-hudud mastata'tum." Avoid implementing penal punishments as much as you're able to. No, we'll cut, let's get these hands cut off. If you implemented had punishment for theft, you couldn't shake hands anymore. You wouldn't be able to shake hands. Everybody'd be like, nice to meet you, right? From the president all the way down to the street sweeper, man. We would. Am I making this up?
This brother, whatever, this person criticizing me for crypto reform or whatnot, because I talked about the hudud in this manner. Wallahi, as Allah is my witness, my conversations with Mufti Taha, they're on my phone. I can even publicize them if need to be, if people doubt this. I'm having a discussion with him about the hudud, and I asked him point blank, I said, so Mufti, this is last year, what do you think then of the proposition that in the modern world, given the nation state and given all of the problems and whatnot, if we call for a rethinking of the hudud for the nation states, not in the Sharia, not a permanent abrogation, but to rethink through in Pakistan, in Tunisia, in Turkey, if we rethink and we make it penalties or, jail or whatnot, is this in accordance with the Sharia? I'm asking him because I consider him my senior in knowledge. He is older than me and more knowledgeable than me. And that's my methodology. I always ask people that I trust. So this is a conversation I'm having Mufti Taha Karan. You know what he said to me? Yes, he said, yes, our history is replete with such examples, and it is in accordance with the goals of the Sharia. He said basically, I don't quote the wordings, he basically said our problem is our ulama are so literalist that they cannot understand that this is of the goals of the Sharia, to rethink through. And because they're so literalist and fundamentalist, he said they have opened the door for progressive Islam, which is something that I've said multiple times. If you're not going to allow legitimate reform, rethinking through the textbooks written 1,000 years ago, rethinking through in light of modernity. Mufti Taha is telling me, yes, we should do this. Shaykh Qardawi is saying this. All of the great ulama are saying this. Does medieval Islamic law prescribe the death penalty for extramarital sex? Yes, it does. Yes, it does. It does prescribe the death penalty for extramarital, not premarital. Adultery, basically. Yes, it does. This law is actually meant more as something in the books to terrify you, rather than to actually implement. The texts say things that are somewhat problematic at times. All religious people know what I'm talking about here, right? The texts have some laws that are somewhat bizarre, and this is all texts. Should they be updated and modernized? Again, that's an ongoing discussion, and that's one of the main sources of intra-Muslim dialogue. Muslims do need to have that dialogue, and they are having it.
I'm coming towards the end of the questions that I've got for you, but I do want to touch on something that we briefly mentioned before. We spoke about the different methods of capital punishment, and we talked about why not modernize them when they were, and you said that rightly so, that there were quicker punishments at the time, but Allah still chose to issue this particular punishment or this particular method. However, there is a wider discussion that needs to be had about, we've mentioned so much about murder and killing and stoning and things like that, that perhaps that was the culture at the time. Perhaps that was the culture at the time for the people at the time. However, now the world has become what many people say much more civilized. Is there maybe a push to change some of these punishments into more modern punishments and modernize the Sharia?
So I think there's a couple of answers to that. I think first of all, if you look at the Islamic punishments, we'll set aside stoning as something we've discussed earlier.
Yeah.
But primarily the punishment being carried out by the sword, that is actually something that is relatively, in fact, out of all of the punishments that are available today in modern times, it's actually one of the most humane and the most sort of, in terms of the way it's carried out, it's easy to carry out. It doesn't have very much room for error. It's relatively quick and, painless to the person it's carried out.
Yeah, perhaps I'm not talking about.
So I'm coming to the point you're talking about. Okay. I'm just sort of saying that in that sense, I don't see there to be any reasonable grounds for talking about. If you look at the situation with lethal injection right now, if you look at the situation with electrocution and so on, none of those are any better than, and in fact, all of them are worse than what Islam puts forward. That's one point. Now on this topic of modernizing Sharia, I think that first of all, one of the things we have to start with is we have to start with the statement of Allah Azza wa Jalla, الْيَوْمَ أَكْمَلْتُ لَكُمْ دِينَكُمْ وَأَتْمَمْتُ عَلَيْكُمْ نِعْمَتِي وَرَضِيتُ لَكُمُ الْإِسْلَامَ دِينًا. Today I have completed my favor upon you. Today I have completed your religion for you, completed my favor upon you, and chosen for you Islam as your religion. What Allah Azza wa Jalla chose for us on that day is for us today. It's not for us to modify it. It's not for us to need to modernize it. It is the perfect system from Al-Hakim, Al-Alim, Al-Khabir. It doesn't need to be updated. It doesn't need to be modernized. It doesn't need to be changed. And I would provide an evidence for that, not only from the Sharia point of view, but even from the logical point of view, is what I alluded to at the beginning of the failure of modern legal systems to address the problems in the society. It's quite clear that these modern systems are not doing the job. They're just not effective. They're not doing the job. And I think that when you bring Islam as a whole, and I keep emphasizing this, we really have shone a very strong light on the Islamic sort of punishments, legal punishments, things like that, criminal law and things like that. That doesn't show the whole picture of Islam. Islam is not a society where there's just a row of people with swords raised above their heads waiting to chop things off. That's not what Islam is about. And that's never been what Islam is about. You have to put that in context as a necessary deterrent to ensure safety, security, and peace for everyone in the society. That doesn't need to change. It doesn't need to be updated. In fact, we need to go back to that. We need to go back to punishments that actually make a difference, punishments that actually provide some kind of retribution on behalf of the victim, punishments that more than anything stop other people from going into it. وَلَكُمْ فِي الْقِصَاصِ حَيَاةٌ. You have life in the law of retribution. You actually stop people from going down this route. And also punishments that are not a burden upon regular people, where we have to pay for keeping some really horrific and evil people behind bars. And we have to kind of pay for that. So I don't see any logical reason, and I certainly don't see any Shari'i reason to change what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us. If anything, we need to go back to that implemented properly. When it's not implemented properly, then that's not representative of what Islam has.
Speaking of going back, do we not go back to the scholars that preceded us? For example, there's the 8th century Maliki scholar Abu al-Qasim al-Burzuli, who actually called for the replacement of the hudud as we describe them today with things like financial penalties. What do you have to say about that?
I don't think that's actually a correct quote from Abu al-Qasim al-Burzuli, rahimahullah ta'ala, Maliki scholar. I believe what the discussion is what I alluded to earlier about not about the financial penalties as a replacement for the hudud, but as financial penalties in terms of ta'zir. Is it allowed for a judge to implement a financial penalty. And I did allude earlier to the fact that the jumhur of the ulama, the majority from the Hanafiya, the Malikiyya, the Shafi'iyya, and the Hanabila, they held the opinion that it's not permissible, that financial penalties are not a tool that is available to the qadi in that sense, except where there is a clear evidence in Islam for that. And Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah and others, and among them others from those we've quoted, they held the opinion that it is permissible to introduce financial penalties in the aspect of discretionary punishment. That is what I have understood from what I have read. Okay. I did go through the book today, and I did look at some of the quotes earlier on. And from what I can see, and again, we can look at this in more research, we can bring it in the Q&A if there are further things to look at, but what I can see from this is this discussion is about the use of discretionary financial punishment and nothing to do with replacing the hudud.
What about the argument that the world has changed, which is evident? I don't think either of us would disagree with that. The world has changed since then. It's become more cosmopolitan, it's become more multicultural. That inevitably will have an impact on things like apostasy.
Crime has increased.
And yeah, crime is increasing.
People are less safe.
So these kind of things that have, with even not aside from those facts, which I agree they are facts, but aside from those, even the fact that the technology has just changed the way we live. And the day-to-day transactions that are taking place nowadays are just so different. How can we refer to laws that were based around 7th century Arabia and still believe that despite the world changing so much that they're still applicable today?
So I think there are two things here. I think first of all, the fundamentals of human interaction haven't changed. Murder is murder. Murder today is murder. Yeah. We haven't got to the level where murder is like someone deleting your social media account or something like that. You know, like murder is murder. Yeah. Zina is zina. And so on. Those fundamentals haven't changed. And those are fundamental human, they are crimes against humanity on a level of humanity. And it's generally in every society, they are considered to be really terrible, horrific crimes. Things like murder, adultery, fornication, and so on. That is one aspect. The second aspect is that, as we've mentioned in several times, Islam provides a framework for dealing with what we call nawazil and mustajiddat. Now, murder is not a nazila. Murder is not something new that turned up yesterday. Neither is fornication something new. Neither is apostasy something new that turned up last week. We also talked about the Jewish law of stoning to death for the one who invites someone to another religion and so on. This is not something that turned up last week. These are not nawazil, they're not mustajiddat. They're not new issues that need to be looked at in the concept of, or in the framework of Islam. They're just simply things that were there before, they're there now, and they have their rulings. However, if there are nawazil, like financial crimes,
right?
And says, we talked about theft, being theft from a place of safety, a hirs, a place of safety and security. What does that represent in terms of Bitcoin? That is a nazila. It's a new issue that needs to be looked at in light of the Islamic evidences through things like qawa'id, principles, qiyas, analogy, other tools that are available to the mujtahid in order to determine where this sits or what the conditions sit in terms of the laws under punishments for theft. When is it a discretionary punishment and when is it a had min hududillahi azza wa jal? That is something which is looked at in the framework of what Islam is giving. There's plenty of guidelines. For example, the use of the word hirs. Hirs here in theft is a place of safety and security that could be potentially considered to be as digital as well as physical, because the word used is broad. But that's for the scholars and the mujtahidun to look at and to analyze and then to apply the rulings of Islam to them. Islam adapts to changes in the world. Changes in the world are nawazil. Allah Azza wa Jal adapts the religion of Islam to them through principles and through the tools that are available in ijtihad. As for things that have always existed and still exist today, those don't need reform.
Okay, you mentioned in there the principles, and you mentioned something like al-qawa'id al-fiqhiyya, for example. Is it not one of those principles, al-'ada muhakkama, that the customs can play an impact on a ruling? For example, when we talk about the ruling of a woman not being allowed to travel, many scholars say that there isn't a set distance, it's rather what the urf, like the customs of the people define as traveling.
So this has an important principle that comes before it.
Okay.
And that is that when you have a nas, you have an evidence a textual evidence, there is no room for any of the aspects of ijtihad. There is no aspect of looking at the urf, because the urf is muhakkama in that which the Sharia did not provide a had for, did not provide a definition for, or a limit for, or a particular ruling for. In this case, al-urf, the urf is muhakkama, no doubt. So we have the principle, la ijtihada ma'an nas. There is no right to have, to exercise legal judgment in the face of textual evidence. So there are things in which Islam left it to urf, and there are things in which Islam did not leave it to urf. And no doubt these hudud are hudud. The very word had is something delimited and chosen and fixed.